listening to the Virtual CISO podcast, providing the best insight on information security and security IT advice to business leaders everywhere.
Hey there, and welcome to yet another episode of the Virtual CISO podcast. With you, as always, John Verry, your host. And with me today, Ed Chandler. Hey, Ed.
Hi, John.
How are we doing this fine Monday post-Thanksgiving afternoon?
Well, I'm still working off a little bit of that turkey.
Well, hopefully you're not tired from all the tryptophan, because I'm expecting you to be up and about on this, right? Because we got some fun stuff to talk about. Before we begin that conversation, I always like to start easy. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what is it that you do every day.
Yeah, so I'm currently the national sales manager for TÜV SÜD America, and my role is specifically helping organizations meet different types of standards and requirements around certification. Cybersecurity is a deep passion of mine. It's something that I've done for quite a while. I've been in the cybersecurity industry in one form or another since 2010. It's all different types of things, anything from different types of assessments to technologies, managed services, and then I came back to assessments, which is where I feel the most at home.
Always ask, what's your drink of choice?
Oh boy, if it's a cocktail, I think I'd have to go with an old fashioned. But if I'm going to be drinking it on the rocks or neat, I would say I'm a big fan of scotches from Eastleigh.
Ooh, yeah, I'm not a peat guy. I think that's a whiskey spoiled, but I do enjoy. I'm more of a man. If I'm gonna, I like bourbon a lot, but if I'm gonna drink a bourbon drink, it tends to be a Boulevardier or Manhattan over a old fashioned. Although my sister-in-law on Thanksgiving made old fashions, and she did a fantastic job. So I got to be honest with you, I had a couple. All right, so thank you for coming on today. And really what I wanted to chat with you about is an information security standard that a lot of people have not been traditionally familiar with. And although most recently it seems a lot more people are getting familiar with it, because we've seen an absolute surge of interest over the last 3 or 4 months. That standard is TISAX, TISAX. So I'll ask you to start easy. What is TISAX?
Sure. It's a great question. It's a standard that was created by many of the automakers, specifically a group in Germany called VDA, which is Verband der Automobile Industry, which is a consortium of basically different OEMs as well as tier suppliers. And the intent of TISAX was, when they were building it, was instead of having one subset of requirements under Volkswagen, another under BMW, and another under Daimler, was to be able to create a standard that these different OEMs would accept. And as of today, they're currently accepted by the 3 major German OEMs.
Yeah, now, I'm curious, are you seeing the same surge in interest? If so, what would you attribute it to? Is it just a matter of are we seeing other non-German manufacturers beginning to use it? Is it just that the German manufacturers are getting a little bit more serious about managing supply chain risk? Is it flow down, from major parts providers? Why am I hearing so much about it in the last 3 to 4 months?
Yeah, it's not a new standard. It's been around for about 4 or 5 years. It was initially rolled out in Europe, and the reason why we're starting to see a significant impact today is that over time this has slowly been brought out into the Americas. The initial rollout was in Europe. And after the last 3 or 4 years of talking about it, they finally set the line in the sand, stating that organizations do need to follow it. European organizations in general are much more ahead in regards to TISAX. There's a much larger subset. When it comes to the OEMs that are following it, as I mentioned earlier, Volkswagen, Daimler, and BMW are the ones that are pushing it down from an OEM perspective. There's been talks about other organizations joining in, because for instance, some American OEMs will use different types of standards that they've built together with AIAG. But overall, as a whole, this is the first time that any of the OEMs have come together to build that same standard and have that same subset. With that being said, as well, we are starting to see not only OEMs pushing it down, but as you read through the participant handbook and you look at different types of things and how they explain it, some of the tier ones are also starting to talk about this as well. In particular, people that are supplying under ZF or Bosch are also organizations that are starting to reach out, for TISAX because they like the standard so much within that business segment that they wanted their suppliers to follow it as well.
Yeah, that specific instance is one that I was on the phone just a couple of days ago with somebody, and I asked them. I said, "Oh, I'm assuming this is flow down from one of the German OEMs," and they were like, "Nope, this is from one of their primary subcontractors, right? And we're getting flow down through them." So I'm guessing that is part of the reason why we're seeing a lot more focus on it. And do you know offhand whether or not these OEMs increased focus is at the behest of or at the direction of the OEMs? Because they want, it's really at that point it's full supply chain, right? It's third party.
Yeah, so I think a lot of it comes down to when they're looking at the requirements of TISAX themselves as being a tier one supplier. One of the requirements is how do you manage the security of your suppliers downstream? And you can do that a few different ways, and not to say one way is right or one way is wrong. It just depends on how your organization wants to handle the security challenges of your supply chain. One way that an organization will handle it is they'll do it through the use of questionnaires, which is typically most common. We see that quite frequently here in the United States. Another way that organizations will do it, and we see this a lot in Europe, is around organizations will actually go out and do a lot of supplier audits. So they'll have cybersecurity professionals go out on behalf of the organization and actually audit the company. The third way is they do it through the path of certification. And I think that's kind of that happy medium we're starting to see a lot of organizations take through, because they have more trust in it, knowing that a third party has taken a look at the organization's cybersecurity footprint, at what things that they're doing in place, and they're not just necessarily taking their word for it from a questionnaire any longer.
Yeah, you just touched on an interesting question that I did want to ask you as well. So when you think about information security frameworks, you can either have an attestation associated with them, or you can have "quote unquote" a certification associated with them. Yeah, so as an example, SOC 2 is an attestation. ISO 27001 is a certification. TISAX is indeed a certification.
So it's more of and I use the word a little bit vaguely. It's not necessarily a certification in that sense. It's more of an attestation in the sense of there's different types of levels. There's not an actual certificate that comes along with it. It's a third-party assessment, if I were to use the correct terminology there.
Okay, good. Yeah, no, I wasn't quite sure about that, and I'm always hesitant to use those terms because we all do use them interchangeably, but technically there is a slight delta between them. So perhaps the most critical element, so if you're a provider to an OEM or work through their supply chain, and somebody says, "Hey, we want you to attest to TISAX," I think perhaps the most critical element of understanding what your TISAX requirements are something referred to as assessment objectives. Can you explain the assessment objectives?
Yeah, so if I were to take them and put them into three bundles, there's three main objectives and there's some sub-objectives behind it. There's the information security objectives, there's the prototype objectives, and then there's the data protection objectives. When you look at information security, the first one, there's two ones that you can choose from. You can either choose high protection needs or very high protection needs. And that question is a or question. So you have to choose one or the other. In regards to prototype protection and data protection, prototype has another 4 subset requirements based off of the different types of prototypes that you're dealing with, whether they're parts or the actual full vehicles. Or data protection depends on the type of data that you're doing, and there's another 6 requirements between those two, between prototype protection and data protection.
Right, and to be specific, right? The data protection requirements are around personal information, and largely, I would argue it's a validation that you've got a GDPR compliant or GDPR aligned privacy program. Fair to say?
That's fair to say. Most organizations that are going down the realm of data protection are usually service providers that we see, and that can be in the realm of like HR type providers, like different types of dependent on how your information you're handling that type of information if they're sharing that with you.
Yeah, we're actually working with a company that does just that HR consultative work, and they've been asked to provide TISAX attestation. Also, speaking with someone that does marketing on behalf of one of the companies, so more B2C marketing. So they're kind of promoting when someone's lease expires, as an example. So yeah, they're being asked for the same type of thing. And now in a alignment where, in concert with assessment objectives, I think another important component is what they refer to as assessment levels. Can you talk a little bit about the assessment levels, please?
Yeah, so there's 3 assessment levels. There's assessment level 1, assessment level 2, and assessment level 3. If you think about assessment level 1, it's a self-attestation. It means that you've completed what they call as your ISA, or internal security assessment. You'll never find that you'll have an OEM requirement that requests a level 1 assessment, though. The level 1 assessment is really for organizations that find TISAX to be helpful as a cybersecurity standard for themselves, and something that they can put forward as that first step into the realm of cybersecurity. Assessment level 2 is what they call as a validity check. And basically, an organization such as mine would come in and take a look at the validity of what you've done within your ISA. It's not what you would think of as a traditional audit. We would rely heavily in regards to your internal security assessment that you've done, and we want to ensure that that we're spot checking specific areas to ensure that it was done correctly. When you get into assessment level 3, that's what you think of as more of your traditional cybersecurity assessment. And that's going to be more in depth. There's more time that comes associated with it. There's going to be more documentation that's going to be reviewed, etc.
And there is, if I recall correctly, a link between them, right? So by definition, if you're going to be, let's say, the very high, your AO is very high, then that would mean that it's going to be an assessment level 3, correct? Isn't there the AOs and ALs kind of, there's a chart in there, if I recall correctly, that kind of align those two and specify typically which type of an assessment goes with which types of assessment objectives?
That's correct. So rule of thumb is that if you have high, typically you'll find that it's an AL2. I use the rule as lowest common or the highest common denominator. So meaning that if you have all these different assessment levels and you have one that's 3 and you have 2 that's that requires assessment level 2, then you're going to automatically go to a level 3. With very high, it automatically requires that you have an assessment level 3. Anytime you have prototypes and you're touching prototype vehicles, prototype parts, that also requires assessment level 3. And then finally, if you have special categories under data protection, that does require a level 3 as well.
Right. So for most providers, anyone that's touching prototypes, anyone who's touching personal information or highly sensitive information, the level 3 is what we're going to mostly see, correct?
That's correct, and a lot of that has to do with the physical security requirements, especially under prototypes. So they want to ensure that you're not putting in the same garage a BMW next to a prototype BMW next to a prototype Volkswagen next to a prototype Mercedes. Right,
or your testing techs are not taking an undisguised vehicle out for into town to have lunch, so that the Motor Trend paparazzi can take pictures of it and post it in their magazine.
Exactly.
That's funny. So one of the things that I like as an ISO 27001 guy, so to speak, is that TISAX, the information security component of the 3 components of it, is aligned very well with 27001, and I would argue that the GDPR aligns well with ISO 27701. So if you're, and we're seeing this with a lot of our clients, some of them are already certified in one or both. So for those, we're seeing that TISAX certification, I would call it a relatively light lift. What do you see regarding either companies which are previously certified or companies that are considering pursuing both concurrently?
Yeah, no, you bring up a good point. When you look at the internal security assessment, there's actually a great column in there if you've been certified ISO 27001 or 27701 in the past that shows the actual requirements of TISAX in regards to ISO 27001 Annex A requirements. And you'll see it aligns very closely. What we see as an organization, there's really twofold. Number one, you're right, it's a lighter lift for an organization because they've taken into account a lot of these factors already. But also, when you look at like larger organizations or large to mid-sized organizations that have multiple sites that need to go through this type of certification, there's something called a simplified group assessment. And usually organizations that are going to be going through a simplified group assessment are going to want to have a mature management system. And that management system usually comes into the form of a multiple site ISO 27001 or 27701 certification.
Yeah, so that's, like all frameworks, the concept of scoping is arguably the most important, getting the project off on the right foot. So you talked about this multiple locations. Now, my understanding is if the assessment objectives are the same, you can do a single assessment that applies across multiple locations, or you could still do a per location assessment. But if you had multiple sites, let's say one site was doing prototype protection, that requirement was there, while another site didn't have prototype protection but did have, let's say, GDPR protection, privacy protection, that you would then have to actually have separate assessments for each site. Can you talk about what the advantages and disadvantages, what's best practice there, I guess?
Yeah, so there's a couple things. So the answer is absolutely you want to ensure that you have the same set, the same thing is happening, which allows for sampling. The one caveat to that is prototypes, and they want to ensure that prototype sites are being reviewed on an every certification basis. But with that being said, the heavy lifting of the information security and other things are also being considered from that centralized location. When it comes to, if you have multiple things or multiple standards, or you have an organization that has, they're doing prototypes at this location, for some reason they've got, GDPR information or PII at personally identifiable information at another, location, then obviously the best path forward will most likely be single site certifications or multiple site certifications.
So question for you, and I don't know if you're an ISO 27001 person as well, but in ISO 27001 we have this differentiation, I'll call it, between the scope of the management system, scope of the ISMS versus the scope of the audit. So, it's very common with ISO that the scope of the management system is, let's say, global to an organization. But if on the certificate we just list a single location, that is the only location that the auditor is attesting they have validated the operation of that management system. Does that same concept exist? So as an example, if I've got let's say three locations that all have the very high information security assessment objective, but no other assessment objectives. If I've got three locations and all of them have that same objective, am I able to have a information security program that manages those requirements across all three locations, but have you only assess one location, or by default do you have to go to each location?
Yeah, that's actually up to the eyes of the beholder and how they want to go about it. So absolutely, we have the ability to go in and only certify one or assess one organization.
Okay.
And there's no need for us to hit all three. Now, there's going to be times for that location as we do the audit, they're going to be considered a central function of that ISMS. So when you go into it, there's going to be a good chance that Global will be called into the audit quite frequently to be able to help with the evidence of the audit itself.
Gotcha. And then one thing we probably should have pointed out. So while assessment objective 1 and 2, you'll have one or the other. It is possible, and not unlikely for some organizations, that they will have multiple assessment objectives applied to them, right? So you could have very high number 2, and then you could have one of the prototype requirements and the privacy requirement, right? That's AO 7 and 8, I think, or 6 and 7. You could have up to 3 assessment objectives, or could it even, technically it might even be more, right? Because you could have multiple prototype assessment objectives applied to you.
Yeah, I mean, technically you could have, I'll say all 7, because the first question is an or, whether you have high or very high information security needs. But the rest of them you could add into it. And a lot of the times that makes sense if you have, for instance, you're touching prototype parts, prototype vehicles, test vehicles, because it's going to have the same types of physical security requirements between those.
Right, and assessment objective, the very high assessment objective is just a superset of the high, right? So by definition, if you get to the very high, you already have the high, which is why you're saying effectively all 7 objectives can apply to you.
That's correct. So if it's an or question of what the label shows up as, but effectively, because of the very high or high, if you're going to have high protection needs, you're automatically going to get that with very high.
Gotcha. And one of the other questions that I had for you was, I know you see, and actually there's even a reference to it in the participants handbook now. And I know it was more commonly used during the pandemic, a assessment level 2.5.
Yeah. So 2.5 is something that was used during the pandemic in particular. It no longer is in full-fledged, but there are ways that you can do this as a off-site assessment. However, there's some caveats that come along with it. But the 2.5 assessment was with assessment level 3, you're required to actually be on site to perform that assessment. If we weren't able to show up on that site due to, for instance, COVID concerns or something like that, the organization was able to do a 2.5, which gave them essentially their temporary labels, where they had 9 months to close that out. Today, there's not necessarily that same 2.5 requirement. The 2.5 is now really, it's an assessment level 3. We're able to complete the assessment, not do it on site, but then you'll be issued a nonconformity for not being able to do it on site, which then we have to close. So essentially, it's still there. It's just it's a different.
It's been effectively been denigrated. It was largely something that helped us get through the pandemic, and now that we're, knock on wood, my desk isn't real wood, I don't think, but could try anyway, right? We're out of the pandemic, right? Well, now we're just into the endemic, which hey, it's still an emic. That was one thing I wanted to ask you as well, because you just used the term, and I've heard people get confused by this. You hear that TISAX label. Explain what a TISAX label is.
Yeah, so the labels are based off of your objectives, and it's basically a label states that you have been assessed towards that objective. For lack of a better term, you could say that it'd be kind of like a certification minus the background of what a certification means. So it basically means that you've been through the assessment, you've received those labels. Those labels are based off of the objectives you've chosen and been audited against. Gotcha.
And just to be clear to everyone, ENX administers the program, and ENX has established a group of, I think the right term is authorized assessment or authorized audit providers. Do they refer to it as an assessment as an audit formally?
Correct. So they're called audit providers, if you will, if you look at the website.
Okay, yeah. So in terms of like taking someone through the process, an organization determines that they have a TISAX requirement. They first should make sure that they fully understand assessment objectives that apply, and the assessment level that goes along with that, or is the expectation of the entity requesting the certification. They may or may not work with a firm like Pivot Point, helping them get prepped for and be prepared for that certification or attestation, excuse me. Then they would engage somebody who is an authorized audit provider, TÜV SÜD being, I think, is there also a TÜV Nord? Like, aren't you guys? Isn't TÜV like the original the original entity that was authorized to provide these types of certifications?
Yeah, so the history of TÜV goes back quite a while. It's a 160-year-old history. I won't get into the details of it, but essentially we were founded as the testing and inspection organization for anything. You know, if you go into an elevator, you get an emissions test, you get your car TÜV'd at that point. So TÜV technically stands for Technical Inspection Agency in German. It's a very long and German word. With that being said, you know, there are a few of us. What happened was that each state had its own TÜV, and over time, you know, that showed to be very inefficient. So there was a lot of period of M&A, and now there's 4 TÜVs. There's really 3. One is a subsidiary of TÜV SÜD. TÜV SÜD is the largest one, and SÜD stands for South.
Gotcha. So, you know, that would be the next thing that they would do, right? Is pick an authorized audit provider, and then be subject to this audit. How long would a typical audit take place? Give someone an idea of what they can expect from an audit.
Yeah, so there's 3 stages to the audit. The first is there's going to be a kickoff meeting for the audit, usually held, you know, at least a week or 2 weeks before the audit occurs, so you can get to know your auditor a little bit, what the expectations of the audit, and they'll go through that at that point so that you're not left in the dark. At that point, you know, there's an audit that'll take place. The longest that an audit will ever take place for, you know, a specific location will be a week long. It'll never go past that week timeline for a specific location. It could be 3 days, probably as a minimal, just to give the audience an idea. And then there's a closing meeting that will happen. Usually, you know, it can happen a week or 2 weeks after, but usually right after the audit, depending on, you know, what's found.
Gotcha. And I'm assuming that there, you know, in the event that there's a nonconformity identified, that there's a corrective action process and, you know, some type of period of time to cure said nonconformity, and then some validation process that you guys would go through to validate that they have indeed closed said nonconformity.
Correct. So you have 9 months to close your nonconformities after the last day of the assessment. If you have minor nonconformities, it's okay. What will happen is you'll receive what they call as temporary labels, and those temporary labels are good for 9 months after that last day of the assessment. If there's a major nonconformity, what will happen is that you have the ability to implement a corrective action. That corrective action will then be downgraded to a minor nonconformity, potentially based off of what that is. And once that's then closed out, then you'll be able to receive temporary labels. And then once you're able to prove the implementation that this has taken place, and you can show that this is in place and currently working, then we'd be able to close out, you know, as a corrective action. And
Gotcha.
Those permanent labels will be given.
And then does ENX act as a, you know, an entity that maintains the records associated with someone's TISAX labeling? So in other words, if I go through this process, would I then be listed somewhere, you know, on like the TISAX, on the ENX website, so that way if you know, VW wanted to validate my standing, they're able to do that?
Yeah, so there's actually, and you mentioned it earlier, the participant handbook. There's a lot of great information in there, and that's one area in particular that kind of walks you through what it looks like. But you'll go onto the ENX website, the OEM or whoever your passive. There's a passive and an active participant. You can be both, but your passive participant, which would be your customer, would be able to go in and they'd be able to see, okay, ABC company has labels for this. They've gone through this type of assessment. You have the ability as an organization to show how much information you actually want to share. One key note, though, is that as you go through it and as you look at what information you want to share, once you give access to that information, you can't revoke that same access.
Gotcha. And it's a 3-year certification cycle?
Correct. It's not. I
3-year attestation cycle. I keep using the same terms. We're going back and forth.
Yeah, I want to be careful just because so many people are so used to like ISO 27001, where we talk about it being a 3-year cycle where you have a certification or a recertification, and then you have 2 surveillance audits for those prior years. For TISAX, we don't have those same surveillance audits. So once you go through it, your label is good for 3 years after the last day of that audit.
Gotcha. We beat this up pretty good. Anything we missed from your perspective?
One thing that I do want to add in that I think will be helpful for anybody in the audience that's going through this today is we do hear quite frequently organizations coming in and they struggle with understanding what those objectives are, and there's many ways to go about it. I do always suggest to our customers or anybody that we talk to throughout this process that they truly understand from the OEM what their expectations are. Because I like to think that if I assume, I'm usually wrong. Doesn't mean that you all or everybody will be wrong with those assumptions, but in that sense, it's always good to get direct information whenever possible from your customer what their expectations are.
Yeah, because it would be painful, to go through the process at either a high and not hit very high and find out you were very high, or not realize that they expected prototypes or they expected privacy.
Exactly.
Yeah, gotcha. All right. Give me a fictional character or real-world person you think would make an amazing or a horrible CISO, and why?
I'll say Michael Scott from The Office. I think that while he would not be a very good CISO because his mind is all over the place and he's not setting his strategies up in a correct manner, I think he also depicts what CISOs go through every day because there's so much stuff going on and there's so many different topics that people want to talk about and things that you need to be concerned about, that it's almost the real life of when you look at Michael Scott and you look at the way he thinks, it's almost the real life of what we see today. But I do think he would not be a very good CISO because he doesn't have the best ability to prioritize.
Yeah. What about Dwight Schrute? Do you think Dwight Schrute would be a good CISO? I mean, he's got that experience running the beet farm, right?
He does have the experience running the beet farm. I think that anybody who worked for Dwight might not want to work for Dwight very long.
I know Jim wouldn't want to. Not that I've ever seen this show that you're referring to.
No. I think Jim and Pam definitely would have some challenges working for Dwight.
Yeah, absolutely one of my favorite shows, and I always smile when somebody makes a reference to it. I almost was going to say that's what she said, but I couldn't find a way to work it in there that actually was contextual. So if folks wanted to get in touch with you or TÜV SÜD, Ed, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, you can reach out to us via our website. You can reach out to me directly. I'm always available. I'm on LinkedIn, or you can reach out to us via our Contact Us form. We're happy to help and provide any information as questions come up.
Awesome. Thanks, man. Appreciate you coming on to chat about TISAX. This was helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you, John.